Nice to see you all. And for anyone who's watching now or later, just to say this is a little conversation that we at And Other Stories have decided to pull together some people that we know are scandalously good translators, Italian researchers, and well, Richard's the mystery card that will be revealed perhaps later, how Richard fits into this. Yeah, I guess just worth saying this is being recorded live on YouTube now and then going out. So if anyone wants to add comments, just to know that you are your other people can see them later. But we'd love to hear your comments. And apart from that, we're just looking forward to a good chat about Italian literature and Italian literature in translation. And I will very briefly just introduce. I'm the publisher at And Other Stories, and we're very lucky this year to have, well, sort of in 12 months from now to this time next year, 3 Italian books coming out, and 2 translators of them are with us. So I'll start with them. Jamie Richards is the translator of The Hunger of Women by Marosia Castaldi, which comes out in the UK in October 23 and early December in the US. And Brian Robert Moore is the translator of 2 Michele Mari books, You, Bleeding Childhood, which just came out in July in the UK and now in August, indeed today, in the US. And then next January 2024, Michele Mari's Verdigris. So, and I'm looking forward to, maybe we can hear a bit from those or other things that you've been translating later. Richard Village, well, I'm going to, I think we'll probably just hear from you in a little bit. Richard Village, I know has a background in marketing, but has other plans on the way, and is a reader and speaker of Spanish, Italian, and anything else.
I can manage French as well, Stefan.
That's it. Yeah. And Giorgia Tolfo, it has translated books, but is, I think you'd say, primarily a researcher and curator, curating the Festival of Italian Literature in London and running a podcast related to that, which is, and maybe you can give us the name of the podcast for anyone?
Yeah, it's called The Italian Files.
That's it, yeah. Because the festival is FIL, right?
Yeah, it's FILL, Festival of Italian Literature in London, because it's in London. And the podcast is called The Italian Files. It's not entirely on literature, but some episodes are on literature. So it's nice to be here and talk about it, among other things.
Yeah. I've sort of not really podcast listening at the moment, so I've lost a bit of track. But is there a current series, or are you preparing the next one? Or?
So we've done the first season for now, and we are still thinking and considering whether we'll go on with our second series. It's still in progress. Depends on many things, but yeah, if it comes out, it will come out probably early next year, but still in progress. TBD.
Yeah. And there was a series that the Italian Culture Institute, I think, was there was somehow related to the Italian Culture Institute in London about Venice. Was that also something you were involved
in? So Phil was born as a festival of Italian literature, and then considering what happened in the world in general, we tried to diversify the things that we do, and so we started. During the first year of the pandemics to do a podcast, and we did a podcast called The Fifth Siren, which is on Venice, and it's a 5-episode podcast, and it tells the story of Venice through different lenses: the economic crisis, environmental crisis, but also the lens of culture and history. And we tried to interweave all these narratives together and try to give a narration of Venice as a sort of microcosm of like our world right now. And and there are a lot of literary references, as well as a lot of scientists, researcher, and activists talking in the podcast. Whereas the second one, again, was produced by Phil, which is originally like the festival, but has become a sort of entity that changes. It's a series of independent episodes. Each of them has a different theme, and among those, one was dedicated to the writer Goliarda Sapienza. One was dedicated to well, I have to look at the series, but like various writers, but also themes like the importance of Sanremo, the music festival, which was the festival on which Eurovision was based on, and like the importance of female sport, and in Italy, and many other things. So I won't go into the details because maybe people want to listen to it. But we delved into specific themes and people and moments in history, which are particularly interesting and less known, which is the most important thing.
Am I right, Brian? Did you translate something by Goliarda Sapienza? Yes,
I translated Meeting in Positano, and the podcast is mostly, the episode is mostly, however, about the art of joy, which I did not translate. So I won't take any credit for the material in that podcast. But it's a very nice episode. It's a really nice overview of her life. So everyone should check it out. I haven't listened to the Sanremo episode yet, but I've been meaning to.
Yeah, I'm desperate to now, having said it. I think it sounds marvelous.
Well, I'm a big Sanremo fan over the last few years. I've gotten very into it. So we even had a viewing party in New York this year. So we're trying to,
Yeah. I have a very, very patient husband who watches all 5 nights for 5 hours a night, and he still stays with me.
Wow. Well, my wife is Italian, so that, she's the one who kind of forced it on me originally. But the only way to watch it is in the United States or in a similar time zone. I mean, you can't watch it in Italy. I mean, stay up till 2 a.m. 5 nights in a row. It's kind of unfortunate.
I mean, I somehow manage. Anyway, Colapesce Dimartino were robbed.
Oh, they were robbed.
100
twice.
They were robbed twice. Absolutely.
So, where when you're not in Italy, can you see it? Is it on YouTube, or how
it's very streamable on RaiPlay.it.
Yeah,
you can stream it.
Yeah.
Jamie,
it's great fun.
Jamie and Georgia, are you aficionados as well, or?
I watch it a little bit. I'm not a huge fan. I don't have to watch it, but I've enjoyed it when I've caught it a little bit.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not particularly interested in Sanremo unless for its cultural relevance, let's put it this way. And I like looking at people watching Sanremo rather than Sanremo itself.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because apart from people in Italy, which stay up till 2 or 3 a.m., I have many friends here in Italy, in London, who meet together in those 4 or 5 days, and they prepare all the voting tools. So they all sit in sofas, and when the song ends, they all raise their hand with them the vote, and then they collect votes and have a sort of like para Sanremo, where they have a system of votes and they have their own winners and things. So it's a big thing. It's really a big thing. Unfortunately, I haven't taken part, but yeah.
You haven't taken part as a singer, or?
The makings of a band here. That's all I'm saying.
The entry next year then to Sanremo, yeah.
Well, it's kitsch, right? I mean, so you have to sort of enjoy some of that Italian pop music and kitsch. Yeah.
Wow, I mean, when you gave the Eurovision connection, I'm sort of imagining it, but I'll have to go and check it out and see what's the Italian magic.
Maybe there's an analogy to be made, right, between Sanremo as an Italian phenomenon and Eurovision as, you know, the translation of countries, literatures, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, literature could do with something of the excitement. It doesn't really happen on Booker night, does it? That people are all sort of like put up their judging their 10s and 8s and no, I think
in Italy, I would say that people who read, like there's a phenomenon that doesn't compare at all with Sanremo. Sanremo is such a big thing, it's a cultural thing, like everyone knows what Sanremo is, and it is really important. But there's this literature prize which is called the Premio Strega, which often create a similar vibe, albeit in the small bubble of people who love reading. So every year there's this long list and then the short list, which is clearly like the Man Booker Prize, except there's the night of the event is streamed on TV, and then people get to vote, and then it's sponsored by Strega, which is a liquor, so it's a drink. And at the end, the winner has to drink a little bit of this liquor. And I mean, not everyone has it.
They're forced to drink it.
Is the bottle, and that is the major Italian prize. And there's a lot of like debate around it, and clearly literary critics and people and publishing industry, like they see this prize from very different perspectives. The winners in the past of the Premio Strega have always been considered quite established writers, but over time, like the way the industry has changed, has become a very popular prize. So now people at the end are like betting on which book will really win. I don't know if it's got the same enthusiasm that the Booker Prize has in the public, but there's a tendency among Italians to look at things and winners and lists and finals that creates quite a lot of enthusiasm, I would say.
But one thing you notice as an American person, perhaps, is that the Strega is televised. So there is some sort of spectacle to it, and all the authors go and tour all of the cities in Italy for all the lead up to it, and just having a televised event, perhaps, adds to that and makes it sort of enjoyable as a public spectacle, because we don't really have that.
Yeah, I'm interested in knowing the numbers, like how many people are really watching the show on the day of the final. But yes, it is televised, which is really.
What does it go out on Rai Tre or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think they tried. Did they? They tried to do the Booker for about 2 years, didn't they? Channel 4, I think, did it for about 2 years, and it was just like not. I think the commissioning editors went, "This is not television."
I didn't know it was so short-lived.
I think they tried about 20 years ago to do it, and it was just like, this is not televisual enough, and it relatively soon stopped, which is a shame. I think it's
I remember about 30 years ago when I was about just sort of finishing school. It was on television, so to me, I sort of. Growing up, I thought that was the norm, but it sounds like it was a short-lived flash in the pan. But it does make it different. Like if it's on TV, I mean, honestly, TV doesn't mean quite the same as it did before. Everyone's streaming completely different things, but being on TV, it was sort of like it sort of you felt like even if you're just sort of looking at the TV schedule and happen to be interested in books, you'll sort of turn it on and people will see it. I quite enjoyed it. I remember, I'm blanking on his name, poet and critic from Northern Ireland. Anyway, blanking on his name now. He'd be quite mean about some of the books, and he added a good bit of a argument to the critics, which was good.
But the other thing about the Strega, which is, I think, has to be said though when comparing, is that whereas if you were, obviously there's always an anticipation of who would win. If you were looking at the Booker, you'd maybe be looking at the books, and you'd be looking at maybe the taste of the particular judges if you were, say, going to bet on what would win. But the Strega, the way they vote is so many people, and it's so political, not in the sense of like, not in the more general sense, but in a very literal sense, like, how publishers and people who are voting decide to divide up their votes. It's almost like if you were wondering how a parliament is going to come together to create a majority. There are all of these kind of political dynamics in the sense of the politics of Italian publishing that go into what eventually wins. So, if you ever read the kind of behind the scenes stuff after, or even beforehand, articles leading up to the leading up to the actual event, it's all like, well, if if A and Audi has 2 books in, how will they divide? Or, these publishers are all part of the same group, so will they decide to all vote for this book and leave that other one in the dust? Or will they concentrate on one to get more votes? It's hard to not be a little bit, it's fun, but it's also, some of it is a little, it's very alien to the way Anglophone awards work, at least as far as the public is allowed to know. I don't know if
Yeah. Does that mean it's always one of the larger houses that wins, or?
Well, there have been historic upsets, and there were periods of time where it was almost exclusively larger houses, and then periods of time where it's much more mixed.
Oh, and has anyone read
it kind of goes in waves.
Yeah. So there's not a board of like voters. There are like 3 different groups. One is the Friends of the Premio Strega. One is a sort of a smaller number, and then there are the publishers themselves, which have a number of votes each. So, for example, each publisher can't candidate more than one. So, for example, and it depends if we are looking at at the holding, or like an independent publisher. But yeah, there are strict rules about how various books are candidated. And this, of course, steers all the debates. One is the debate about the voting system and the value of the work that wins or gets to the final. I think that historically, diachronically, it can be seen as a sort of prize mirroring the change of taste and the change of some cultural tendencies in Italy. I've done a study with another Italian writer on the number of women, for example, that were candidated over time, and you can see the prize, which started probably in the 50s. I think, end of the 40s or 50s. At the beginning, the number of women that got to the final was barely 1 in some limited cases, and then through time that number increases. Then if we look at the long list, it's a little bit different. But again, the number of women increased, but also the number of books candidated every year. And then you can look at the trends in terms of themes. And then, of course, at some point, things became quite popular, and there was a lot of publicity about it. And this clearly clashes with what literary critics think of these works, and they are not literary works. Like, clearly some are. Like Elsa Morante won the Premio Strega, for example, just to mention one, but many others in the 50s, 60s. Maybe more in the contemporary times, it's hard to tell what makes a work literary or not. So even this year, there was a book published on the history of the Strega Prize, and they were looking at all the all the books that won one over time and trying to see which books stayed, which didn't, who were they written by, what were, like trying to sort of making assumptions based on what the results were, trying to see how literary this prize is. But in fact, it isn't literary because of the ways people vote and who votes, but also that doesn't mean at the same time that who wins isn't necessarily not literary. It could be, but
no, it's interesting, isn't it? Because people sort of have this idea that it's the prizes that often makes the book sort of reach the public, but maybe, and I don't know if this is the case, but maybe Elena Ferrante and Natalia Ginsburg and Michele Mari.
I don't think Ferrante has ever won the Strega Prize, honestly.
Maybe none of those have won it. I don't know.
Ginsburg won, but not the other two.
Okay.
It's just it pushes sales only, I would say, and then literary value is another, which can overlap, but not necessarily.
Have any of you read the Strega winner this year? Or not yet, maybe.
Well, I read last year's. Where are we? Is that Spatriati still?
No, that was last year.
That was last year.
Well, maybe you can tell us about that. And Jamie, you said you read the new one, so yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
So it's interesting because this year the prize was won by this book called Come Daria by this writer called Ada D'Adamo. But it is interesting because she also won another main prize, which I think is the Campiello. I hope I'm not wrong, but she died last year. So the book was candidated to all these prizes, and she died before she even knew that the book had made it there, because she was very ill, but she's very young, and I think she's got a daughter with some disability, if I'm correct, because I haven't read the book, and this book is a letter to the daughter, and so it's been considered a very moving and very touching story, which clearly tap on particularly sensitive topics of including the way people with disabilities are treated, and so the book won the prize this year.
Were you saying, Jamie, that you'd had a look at it, or?
I've read a little bit of it. I mean, I don't have much to add. I haven't read all of it. There's a little bit of wordplay with the error, Daria. Her name is Daria of Error, and yeah. So it's about these issues that I think it's very moving, right, and very touching, and maybe very timely, and some of these things, yeah. And I think it was, as far as I know, a bit of an upset. It was a small publisher, relatively, or an independent publisher, a smaller publisher who won as well. So, yeah.
Who was the publisher?
Interesting. Eliot. It's called Eliot.
Eliot, like the English name, Eliot.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Why not? We have a Pushkin press in England, so why not an Eliot press in Italy? And
I think it's with double T, so it's not strictly the same person.
I don't know if it's supposed to be T.S. Eliot or what Eliot, but
yeah, I'm not sure.
Eliot.
Yeah, but the book won many prizes. I haven't read, so I don't know. I know that people have said that the style is very, 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 very literary. Talking about literary and not literary, but also, as I said, because of COVID and everything, the idea of like the way people with disabilities live, and like how at some point we all felt, we couldn't really move, and we had to look at the world and each other from a different perspective, and how all these things came together. Because I think she wrote it during the years of the pandemics, just before she died. So that there's a lot there, even outside of the book, that made the book interesting. And I'm not claiming that it isn't well written, and far from that, but also the story has clearly brought it to attention quite a lot.
And Richard, did you say you'd read last year's winner?
Yeah, I read. I actually really enjoyed last year's. I mean, I don't know. Has anybody else read Spatriati? Did you like Spatriati? No.
I'm not a big fan. I've read a couple of stories published elsewhere by the same writer, and didn't really speak to me that much.
I quite enjoyed it. I quite enjoyed the, you know, the leaving, the having to leave, the having to go to Berlin, the all that sort of thing. I mean, you know, I think I see how it's possibly more interesting for an English audience than for an Italian audience.
That's an interesting question. Do you guys think that the Italians read different Italian literature to the Italian literature that we're reading, or that we want to read in English often? Well, there was some nodding. Go on then.
Go first.
Jamie and then Brian, maybe you're both nodding.
Maybe a little bit. I mean, obviously, you know, the canons are moving at different speeds, right? So, you know, the books that we're doing for you are books from the 90s and the 2000s. And so that's something very interesting that happens in translation. You have this opportunity to bring older works back into a contemporary conversation. Even if they're not so old, you know, 10 or 20 years old, that can be sort of ancient in, I don't know, literary agency speak, right? So there's like, let's try and sell the latest Strega or the latest bestseller or Elena Ferrante or whoever. And then there's sort of that going back and recuperating. I mean, even someone like, you know, like Michele Mari, everyone has loved him for so long. It's kind of like, as from a translator's point of view, you think, well, if no one has published that person yet, why would they do it now? But so it can be if you are a literary translator thinking about, you know, what you might want to propose in English, what is missing in English. Sometimes you do go back a little further, but then it can also be a harder sell because it's like you're imagining, well, why did no one care about this back then? And I feel like it's a very different moment right now because I feel like everything is coming out. You know, like Italian literature is sort of exploding.
And no one published translations in the 90s apart from Serpent's Tail and Dolky Archive and New Directions and a few others. It was there must have been masses of gaps, I guess. Sorry, Jamie.
No, I agree. So right, like what constitutes a gap? What do we need to be reading? I guess. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything.
I guess so. I am chiamato in causa with Michele Mari. So it's a great point. Mari is a kind of interesting in between because the books that we're doing are not his most recent, but he's still active, you know, and seen as very much a big contemporary name in Italy. But to such an extent that, I mean, I've had countless conversations at this point with Italian readers, and where they literally they do not believe it. I mean, they're so incredulous that he hadn't been published in English. I mean, it's like, I mean, you know, what do you mean Dandalillo has never been published in Italian? Something, not because I think of those as two similar authors stylistically, but that was the first big name of a living author that popped into my head. So yeah, and Jamie, what you're saying about that question, like that's always really important, and it can make you paranoid as a translator. Like, well, if no one wanted to do it before, why would they want to now? And sometimes you have to just remind yourself, again, like not to be too cynical about how publishing works. And again, also, these books came out before And Other Stories existed, and before a lot of the publishers that are even, you know, newer than And Other Stories. They were, you know, these were books that kind of grew over time, grew a really big cult following. Some of his later books became bigger commercial successes, but also building directly on the following he'd amassed over time. So, you know, I think now is a good time to, again, look back at what's been important, going back to last century, and last couple of decades too, or just the last couple of years. And, just remember what it is like when you go to these book fairs and whatnot. I mean, I'm thinking back when I was working at an editorial position, and, you've got the catalog of the highlights from the last year, essentially at most the last year. And that's what agents and rights departments are telling foreign editors about, and it can be up to translators to remind publishers that there's great stuff that maybe the people selling the rights in Italy thought it was a little too weird for an Anglophone audience because we're too commercial. Maybe that's what they think of Anglophone readers. So, it just depends on your perspective a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Sorry, Georgie, you wanted to?
Yeah, no, Stefan, if you want to say something, I think that having 2 feet in 2 different countries and seeing what happens there and seeing what happens here, as Brian said, it's more like the publishing industry that really, and the trends that drives the decisions. So, for example, I think there are two things that have happened in the last, say, decade. One is an increased number of books in translation being published in English, and 2 is the success of Elena Ferrante. And we all know that the Elena Ferrante success had what everyone called the Ferrante effect, which was an increased interest in Italian literature, which before that wasn't particularly there. So there's been a sort of attempt to try to find the next big hit. That it is interesting, the case of the Elena Ferrante, because probably and maybe the audience who is watching us tonight knows already. Elena Ferrante didn't have the success it has now until it had success in the Anglosphere. So it was a sort of like backlash. In the sense that once they saw that it sold so well abroad, then people started reading her, and it became a sort of obsession. And so everything like sold is a sort of like increased attention and effect. So clearly, publishers, seeing that success, wanted to find the new Ferrante, the new big hit, and clearly there was the Italian wave. A number of writers were published, and some very like literary traditional part of whatever we want to call canon, although I'm really I don't particularly like the word canon. I'm anti-canon, but like Natalia Ginsburg was one which is being published now, and again that was not a big success, not probably the same numbers as Ferrante, but clearly like a very deep, profound and big, impactful writer who also happened to be lived in London, who happened to live in London for some years. And she was related to she lived at the Institute of Italian Culture because she was married with the director back at the time. And there's this interesting, beautiful essay in Little Virtues where she's talking about living in England and describing this grey sky and the misery of the food, which is super interesting. I particularly like it.
Why would an Italian write something like that?
Who knows? But those were probably I might be wrong, but those were probably the 50s. Or the 60s, 50s or 60s, I think. So clearly, like London now, restaurant-wise and food-wise, I mean, it's a completely different world from then. But having said that, and other writers, Brian, you translated Lalla Romano, who's also another like canonic writer. Mari is also a canonic writer. So you are clearly translating specific writers that are part of the tradition recognized and taught at school. But Ferrante is now being taught at school from time to time. Although at school we tend to arrive to the 40s to Morante, more or less, Moravia and all those others. But then I think that what arrives here is really like the tip of the iceberg. And on one side there are like the big commercial successes. I think that there is this book which I haven't read. I don't even try to, called Il Leone di Sicilia, which is probably like one of the biggest successes of the last few years. I don't know the number of copies won. Clearly, that was immediately published because, you know, you look at sales, you don't even read the book, it's just automatically translated. And then there's all the other world, so the one where you, Brian, Jamie are in, which is like the world of like literary translation, where you try to pick specific writers. But there are a lot of mysteries there to me, and one big mystery is Walter Setti. He's a big important writer, Italian writer, who's now
too.
Yeah, and he hasn't been translated yet. There's another extremely important voice, which is Pier Vittorio Tondelli. Only just one book was published probably 20 years ago, and it's out of print. But there are like so many Italian writers which are like extremely important that they've never tried. Also, Ortese, probably a couple of things have been published years ago. And she's as important as Ferrante, Morante, and all the others. So it's interesting, and I don't know like how things work, because on one way there's the commercial drive, and then on the other side there's probably the work of translators and pitching. I don't know if it's you who pitch these books, or is like specifically enlightened publishers who get interested in books themselves. But these are like two different worlds, and like only things arrive and by some mysterious ways.
Yeah, it's often just that luck of the right person talking to the right person, isn't it? It's sort of, and thankfully people like Jamie and Brian are coming up with amazing writers that us publishers hadn't heard of, to our shame. So yeah. I think it might be quite nice. Oh, there is a question in the chat that I wonder if anyone wants to add something to, from Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. It says, thank you for the interesting discussion. Could you also talk about literary journals in Italy or other platforms where emerging writers might begin their career? I guess sort of interested in sort of hearing about the equivalents, you know, things. Well, you know, where do you guys go to? Are there places you go to find out, you know, about interesting new writing?
So I don't know if other people want to answer. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. There are a number of literary journals. Current, like there are many online. I think there was once. I don't know if they are still on because they change at Speedlight. One was Carmilla, one was Nazione Indiana, but then currently, and then there are some others that are just print only. It depends if people read Italian or they want to read in translation. If you want to read in translation, like various translators, and Brian and Jamie knows more than me, but there are many places like Asymptote or Words Without Borders, I think.
I expect,
yeah.
But for Italian, like, is there maybe one magazine that each of you would like to recommend? I don't know.
I'm reminded with just on the question of translation now, they've been a little on and off, but I think it's running now. The Florentine Review has both the original Italian and in translation, and now they have I can't remember who translates some pretty. Jamie, are you familiar with the?
I have.
Have you translated for them?
Lots of their issues, the Florence Review.
That's what I thought.
It started out as the FLR, and then they wanted to expand the name to the Florence Review, and that's a nice resource. I don't know how easy it is to get because it's a print journal, and you probably need to order it.
Yeah.
Online. I don't know about its distribution, but you know that definitely features a lot of contemporary authors, and they commission the pieces, the stories, and stuff for the most part, and it has a little bit of poetry and nonfiction and fiction. So I think that's also a resource for readers wanting a sampler of, you know, who's writing today in Italian. I tend to read the journals more for criticism, like Nazione Indiana, to read essays and literary criticism more than really to discover new authors. Yeah.
And out of the newspapers, I think Domani now does stories more frequently than any other. I mean, they've all kind of over time experimented with it a bit, you know, and kind of goes in waves. I feel like there's a period where La Lettura, which was published by Corriere della Sera, was doing more stories. I don't think they do, but again, these are things that it's nice when you're there. It's easy to follow, and it's nice to get the printed newspaper and then online, you know. And a lot of them are paywalled, so it's a little bit more of an effort. So I personally forget to do it systematically in the way I would like to.
I think it doesn't have there isn't a tradition, or maybe simply currently is not working much.
Yeah, Nuovi Argomenti is probably the most historic example, and I don't know if they get big names too. It's not always up and coming authors.
From the German, it sort of is thinking of a bit of a comparison. This isn't about where to publish stories actually, but I wonder if there's something like this in Italian, which is in the German language literature. There's one thing called Perlentaucher, which means pearl diver, which is sort of like a summaries. It sort of does summaries of reviews, so you can look up a book and you can quickly see a summary of the different reviews and links to the reviews. Quite a handy resource. And there's another thing, which is a radio show that's been going for 50 years from it's SWR Südwest Rundfunk, Southwest Radio, which has had a critics sort of do their give points. It's there you go. It's the Sanremo. They give points to their best books of the month, and there's a top 10, and then there's a discussion every month about a few of those books in the top 10, which I think is really sort of lovely kind of way to sort of just get a snapshot of what's going on. But that's going off topic a bit. But is there anything like that you find that helps you keep up with what's coming out of Italy, or?
Il Libraio is also online, collects a lot of reviews. Looking up I follow a lot of individual publishers to see what they're putting out, and a lot of publishers will have a very good page with the reviews of their books and stuff.
Was that what you said, Jamie? Il Libraio? Was that what you just said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well,
I wondered, what you're mentioning now, Jamie, of just following individual publishers. Social media is helpful because, you know, publishers there are quite active, and it all just kind of washes over you, and you can just see. Now that Twitter is becoming pretty unusable, I think, you know, I don't know what I'll do going forward to just, you know, learn about things through osmosis. I'm finding it's been a little bit harder more recently to just find out naturally what people are getting interested in terms of new books.
Well, we hope you do. Continue.
It could just be because I'm also I'm too much in the trenches with Mari. That's he said it. You know, he says how he never reads books, and he's always behind the trends. And he says not actively, it's just almost his own, it's his nature. He can't do it. He's always years behind the trends in literature, and you know, maybe someone will give him a book as a gift, and he'll say years later to them oh, thank you, I finally got around to reading it, and they didn't even remember the book that he's talking about at that point. But so maybe I've been a little too influenced by him at this point, and kind of losing touch with what's happening today.
You'll just keep your antenna out for the timeless and eternal, rather.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, maybe this is a good excuse to. Do you think we could hear a bit from something you've translated, Brian? Maybe from one of the Maris, because they are absolutely. I mean, they are scandalously good translations, and
thank you.
I wasn't the editor on them. Jeremy Davies was, and so I came to them quite late, and I was after the acquisitions, after the editing process, and yeah, just I mean, they're both really. I mean, we've had a lovely attention for You Bleeding Childhood, New Yorker serializing a story and whatnot. And I feel though that people are going to be surprised again when Verdigris comes out with the wonderful conversations between the boy in standard Italian and standard English, and the groundsman come rabbit and chicken breeder and who knows what else in well, I don't know. I don't know. Would you read from that book? Maybe I'm feeling that sort of it might be. Really
would I read from Verdigris?
Verdigris. I don't know. What do you feel?
I'm not quite prepared.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And since it is publication day in the US here, I feel like I'd be, neglecting the first child while already. And I don't actually have the Verdigris printed out, and I try to avoid reading on my screen during, because
Well, we'll give you a few months to prepare.
Thank you.
Reading of Verdigris there.
But I thought if you'd like to hear a bit of this, a little section maybe. So thinking about so a lot of the collection are about these childhood obsessions, and many of which are literary, and I guess interesting, connected to kind of what we've been talking about, how discovering foreign literature, in this case, talking about Italian literature in the Anglosphere. In this case, it's a story about a sci-fi series that Mari's grandfather collected, a popular sci-fi series called Urania, and which he said just through the mere cover art introduced him to the dark side of literature. And it's just one example of how, Mari plays a lot with style and literary pastiche, and also a kind of heightened or literary or grandiloquent style, but he's not afraid to mix what most readers would probably consider high and low. I don't think he sees that distinction because it's so ingrained in, this is how he was brought up to read, with comic books next to Melville and whatnot. So this is just one example of the young Mari gazing upon this sci-fi collection, which is again all essentially Anglophone authors. So that's what I was saying in terms of foreign literature arriving. So a kind of reverse, mirror image here. The little boy who still doesn't know how to read sees those thin books in his grandfather's hands, that uninterrupted series of books, and infers his own notion of peril. Sensing in his elder a shaman, and in the books an initiatory clavis to horrific yet solemn mysteries. If he can handle all of those illustrated monsters and live to tell the tale, this is the boy's little brain's awestruck discovery, then he must have entered into an agreement with them. Making agreements with monsters? Poor grandpa, tremendous grandpa, condemned to never slip up. The slightest error and the monsters will be merciless with him, with grandma, with the grandson who spends every Sunday at their house, all of them gobbled up in one go, an immediate mangling. And so the little boy examines him from afar, watches while his grandfather reads one of those books, pretending to play one of his games, but in fact fulfilling the role of witness that has fallen to him. Poor grandpa, what torments is he suffering for our sake? Is everything okay there, grandpa? Is your reading working out? And creeping undetected until he's just a few steps away, the boy cranes his neck to peek once again at those nightmare forms, thinking that grandpa is in their presence. He seems to be sitting here, but he's actually with them, in who knows what obscure point of the infinite universe. So that's just a little peek into the collection. A lot of fascination mixed with terror kind of runs throughout. throughout the collection. You know, this kind of love and nostalgia that can't be disconnected. It's kind of inextricable with horror itself, and also these kind of shifting perspectives. It's one example in a microcosm where the perspective is shifting a lot between a first person, a second person, even a third person, and that's one of the elements of kind of bleeding in the title. The way these perspectives kind of bleed together. I mean, it's very much Mari's childhood, but sometimes it just becomes, your childhood, the reader's childhood. These perspectives kind of all just merge at times. Yeah,
and that sense of the monstrous comes through in Verdigris too. The monster who is the friend, the groundskeeper, who he sees as who is so strongly portrayed as the monster. It's so vividly and baroquely described visually, but it's also his protecting friend, and as he sees him.
It reminds me, since you mentioned Verdigris, what I'm saying, like there's a line in Verdigris where he says, in reference to Felice, who is this monster-like figure, I believe after Felice has said something or done something that really frightens the young Michelino, says, "It seemed to me that without those fears, life was not worth living." And that's really a sentiment that runs throughout a lot of his work. And I think anyone who fell in love with literature, in part, at least, reading, horror or suspense or mystery can really, and not just literature, I mean, I guess any art, can relate to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well,
can I add two things moving from Mari's books to outside of Mari's books? One is that, for who's interested, next year there should be a big exhibition of Enzo Mari's work. So Michele Mari's father, Enzo Mari, was a extremely famous designer. And there will be a big exhibition here in London. And the relationship between Michele Mari and his father is a very complicated one. So other books, there's an autobiography sort of by Michele Mari, where he talks about his relationship with his dad. But the other thing is, I'm curious to know how the English-speaking non-Italian public reads or understands of your Urania collection. And it is interesting because there is another book which was published probably 2 years ago by an Italian writer, so Sandro Veronesi, and the book is The Hummingbird, was translated by Elena Pala, and there's a character that is a collector, and he collects every single number of Urania. And a couple of pages where he lists all the title from, 1 to 100, to the point that he misses one and he goes mad because he misses one number. And it is interesting because Urania are part of, this sort of cultural heritage. These were these cheap books which were published and you could buy at newsagents and provided access to these worlds and represented an era, but also an introduction to literature. Not an introduction, but like a way to access literature that way. So it's a specific moment in history.
That's interesting. So, and it wasn't a homage to Mari. It was just another person having the same obsession with the same.
Because Urania, it's interesting because it's in this case it's Michele Mari, of course, obsession for the Urania, also his relationship with that type of literature, but also Urania have become like a sort of cultural heritage element.
There's also sorry, I was going to say Humboldt Books in Italian has even done in the last few months did a book with it. It has Mari's story in the original Italian, as well as pictures of his actual collection. The collection referred to here, plus an essay about the series, just to say how it's kind of grown Or
yeah, and Michele Mari's comics have also been published a couple of years ago by, I think, Nero. Yeah, and it's a huge book. It's probably like, I don't know, 40 centimeters by 20, and where he was drawing all these stories of him fighting these monsters and rereading classics. For example, Don Quixote. I don't know in English, but in Italian.
It's Ariosto. There's the Cloven Viscount, Calvino's Cloven, I Sepolcri. A lot of classic literature. A lot of medieval, if not not necessarily medieval, written in medieval times, but like in Calvino's case, which plays on medieval and kind of chivalry and adventure and whatnot, and in a very gruesome way. And in terms of the Enzo Mari, the grandfather in this story is Enzo Mari's father. And it's not the same grandparents from the Verdigris novel, which is his maternal grandparents. And Enzo Mari is, he's not named by name, but he's very central to this book. Three stories in particular, or I could say 2.5 focus very explicitly on Enzo, and I think it's very revealing. In the afterword, I wrote a bit too about how, they're like precursors to, in a way, the kind of the germ that leads to his horror memoir, which is also amazing. And which you were mentioning, Georgia, it kind of originally appears here in a few of these stories.
So let me get this right. The horror memoir is the same book that's sort of a biography of his father.
Well, it's a biography. It's an autobiography, essentially, about his childhood, in which he's again in his house in Nazca, where Verdigris is set and where several stories are set, and the monsters in the house summon him and tell him that he has to write his autobiography. And so it has this kind of fantastical structure, which is him in the present, which is supernatural, with these monsters who are demanding this of him. And but what he then reminisces about, the actual memoir that recounts his childhood, focusing on his relationship with his parents again, is, as far as I can tell, all truthful. Though then, it has these supernatural touches to kind of tie it back to that Gothic setting.
I have a little question. Everything that you were saying and talking about Mari and talking about Urania, and also Giorgia, you were earlier you were talking about the distinction between what's considered literary and non-literary, or less literary, or if literary can be separated or distinguished from commercial literature. And I feel like that's sort of been a thread in these books and sort of this conversation. It's a subject that I'm really interested in. I even remember a few years ago, I submitted a pitch, and I don't pitch a lot, but I submitted a pitch to End Other Stories and to you. And the rejection said that it wasn't literary enough. Right.
I have to Google this. Look this up in my inbox.
No. It's, and it's interesting. And I was really like, why? Right. And even, talking about horror, so many Italian writers are influenced by Stephen King, sort of unabashedly. And I don't think very many writers in the US would claim him as an influence, even if, many of them have read him and so on. And sort of what counts. I also do, I do a lot of comics and graphic literature. And that's a sticking point that, that would take us in a whole nother direction. But, whether those are literary or not, and maybe if certain things in Italian are considered more or less higher literature. I don't know.
I fear you've opened a can of worms here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go and have a look at that email now.
I'm thinking not in relation of another stories, but in relation of what is literary, what is not, which even currently these days, I mentioned the Strega Prize that has always been at the center of this conversation. And it is really a hard question. And like, according to who's talking and writing about it, clearly the perspective will be different. There are some like very, very, very like sort of drastic, really sharp division currently between books who sold a lot. People don't want to consider them literary, and like niche books published by independent publishers, they are considered as literary. This seems to be
there's plenty of independently published books that are definitely rubbish.
Interestingly, I mentioned earlier Elena Ferrante, and there's been such a reluctance, such a huge debate around her, to the point that academia didn't want to focus on her work because it was deemed too commercial. And they were like, no dissertations about it, and we don't want to include her in our courses because, you know, like that is really not chick lit, but like popular literature, very public. But then over time, you know, like with the idea of world literature connecting her in a sort of like larger network of connections, and in putting her work in conversation with other works, and then starting to read into the psychoanalytical readings of the characters, etc. Like clearly, like the literary value of the work was pulled out to the point that suddenly, like, everyone was writing even in academia about her work. Some literary critics claim there are parameters by which you can judge if a book is literary or not. I won't go into the details because also I don't know that. Some claims that it's your literary knowledge that can let you read a book and put it into context and conversation with other books and see how it works. But like with cultural studies and putting everything together, like high and low, they kind of came together, and it is becoming harder and harder to tell what is literary or not. I myself wouldn't be able to say what is literary or not. I can follow my instinct and have this sort of like very instinctive feeling for what I feel is literary, which like speaks to me, to my ear, and I can put it in connection with others, but I can't really point my finger to what it is that it is literary. And I think that Mari is on the other side, like, an extremely interesting example, because he's really mixing high and low culture. He's mixing Urania and comics with Ariosto and poetry and many other things. So all seems to me particularly complicated. I clearly, one parameter is probably like looking at the industry right now and how some things are pushed than others, and then people seem to like divide themselves between divide the literariness between like on the commercial line rather than.
But Giorgia, do you think the divisions are different in the Anglosphere from in Italy? So you occupy both spaces, and do you think actually that relationship of literariness and non-literariness is kind of more blurred here perhaps than it is in Italy?
I think that, like, I would say that the amount of Italian literature that is translated in English is so small compared to what is produced in Italy, that like inevitably, like the literariness is like the perception is completely different, because most of what is published in translation from Italian is perceived as literary because it's a literary translation in the first place.
Sure.
But in it, being immersed just in the Italian literary world, of course, like you don't have the same parameters. Like everything is published. I think I have a feeling that one of the probably parameters seem to be if, like, there are critical, like literary criticism articles, or if they suddenly are like a specific books mentioned in an academic paper, or if they made it into a course, even like a contemporary Italian literature course, or sociology of literature, or any other topic, comparative literature, or anything. Like the moment a book starts to be mentioned in university, or it appears in literary criticism articles, that is when like it's the attention that is directed toward the book that starts to guide the book into one slot or another, rather than the book itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is my feeling, but I might be wrong. It's just my subjective
and I mean, I suppose what I was trying to get at was whether you think the mechanisms for pushing it into a certain slot are different here from in Italy. Or so when you're saying, you know, when it comes on a course, are you talking about here, or are you talking about there? Or is it, or do you feel?
No, I'm talking about Italy. Like, I think that everything that comes here, it gets labeled as literary, generally.
Or no one knows about it.
Or no one knows.
I have colleagues. I'm translating romance novels as well. I translate comics. They don't get like counted in whatever statistics, even the most literary ones. So I think some of the things that come out, there's maybe even more that comes out than we realize. And sometimes even when I go back, I really like this book, I wonder if it was ever translated. And then it was, but it's like by some tiny press or by an academic or something that, you know, was published, you know, something very small, and then nobody knew about it. That happens too. So I think there is a bit more that is coming out than we realize as well.
But also that there is that lag that you, Jamie, mentioned earlier between when the book came out originally and when it comes out here, because like some of the books that are appearing in English were published years earlier, so they've already been either canonized or not. So like it's not happening as we speak, as in, for example, like in Italy. So anything that comes out this year, can you label literary, not literary? That is hard. So I can tell you, like, you know, like depends on who's interested and who talks about them. But if books are at least 10 years old or a bit, you know, then you can still see if they are still in print or not. That is also a good way. And all these writers like Michele Mari, it has a big following, although like it is a specific type of readers, is not the big public. Lalla Romano as well, for example. I'm just mentioning some names. Lalla Romano, I don't know how many people are currently reading it in Italian. Like I'm talking about like on a daily basis, because they are classic. Yeah. I really like Lalla Romano as well. But
it is a big topic. The trying to define what is literary. You might have to, I think, probably.
But I also don't want to I have to object to the idea that Mari is not always reaching the big public too. He might be the best-selling living Italian poet also. For one, one of his collections might have sold more than any other collection in recent history. So,
which is I'm intrigued, because if you know. I don't know if it includes. Anyway, before we get into talking about Mari's poetry, I think we won't want to be too much longer. So I'd love, since we can't quite decide what is literary tonight, maybe to hear a bit from Jamie and Richard before we finish. Which is I think Jamie, you brought us Marosia Castaldi's book because you knew we were looking for literary, and that this was literary, and this was. I don't know. Tell us, why did you bring us this? But I feel that you brought it knowing us and with what you felt about this book, which I think is absolutely astounding. At just it's well, you tell us.
Okay. Well, so I was living in Italy at the time, and one of the things that happens too is there's such a high bookstore turnover on the shelves, you know, like things come out and they're there, and they're there for such a short time, and so you're always kind of trolling the bookstores looking for the new stuff. and or just seeing what's there. But and I came across Marosia's work because of Expo. The World's Fair was in Milan that year, and they had some kind of pamphlet about, or maybe it was online, no, I don't remember, but some kind of booklet or something about books related to the themes, because they also hosted, you know, Dacia Maraini, and they had literary events associated with it as well. And I saw this book, I believe there, and I looked it up, and then I met the author and got to know her work. And she had published many books with Feltrinelli and with a few other publishers that are pretty big publishers. But you know, I don't think she had a great literary success. You know, she was not a bestseller, right? And when you know, and she's not widely read, but the few people that I asked who were her readers and such, you know, and I was able to track so many of them down because they were findable, you know, like every single person who had written a review, you know, or she had also taught at the Scuola Holden at the creative writing. She had done some creative writing courses. So, you know, she wasn't completely obscure, but there are a lot of writers like this, right? Where, you know, they put out a bunch of books and maybe they do a few presentations and then that's it. And that happens everywhere with everybody. Anyway, yeah, so I came across her work, and she almost reminds me of like an outsider artist or something, because you know, even she would even write emails sometimes in the same way that she writes, and I think that she was just writing all the time, like really a flusso di coscienza, like really a stream of consciousness, and that comes out in her work too, which I think is almost it's an interesting example, I think, of this problem that can happen where editorial standards can be different in different countries, right? So, you know, in English books, we edit everything. We go through, you know, many drafts, many, you know, copy editor, this and that, and things are very perfect, you know. And you'll see in her books, I mean, she'll use English in her books and it's wrong, you know, or there are little typos or mistakes and things. And you never know what to do with these, but you know, she's writing from this sort of place of like psychic doubling and despair that's very complicated. So I mean, this is sort of the weird stuff I'm interested in. I like to look for outliers. So I chose to work on this book in particular, which is not, you know, which is a regular 200-page length novel. And yeah, I had tried to send it out, and I had tried to get, you know, apply for grants, and no luck. So yeah, until you decided to take it on.
And what do you like about how she's, what grabbed you about how she wrote it? Would you say was there? I mean, I found it. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know it yet, it's a book without full stops, but it's not in any way complicated as a reading experience by that. It's very. I mean, it's you lap it up. I think you really. It's got a real energy that pulls you on, and you don't. So it's an interesting one, and it's experimental, but at the same time, really not. It's not one of those books that you have to really work hard at to read. I think, and I'm not saying that as a judgment on books that you do have to work hard at. There are many books that you have to work hard at that I love, but that was my experience anyway. But I don't know how you found it.
So yeah, another question is like, what is experimental? You know, what is experimental literature? What does that mean? And sometimes it can, you know, come in the form of these seemingly superficial markers. You know, if I open up a book and there are no capital letters, that's going to appeal to me personally, because even though it might be just a gimmick, right? But you know, I did a book like that, and that's what appealed to me when I opened it. You know, maybe it's because of foreign language, you know, and I mean, I've lived in Italy. I've spoken Italian for many years, but still at the same time, it's a different impact opening up these books. And when I see, you know, something interesting, even typographically, you know, I'm interested in these kind of things, or maybe poetic devices in fiction. And her writing is very poetic like that. So not all of her books, many of her books contain standard punctuation, but punctuation was something that she thought about. She has an essay, she has a few essays about it that I'm maybe working on translating, just because she didn't do a lot of critical writing, but she does have a few really interesting essays that talk about punctuation specifically, and not just in her work, but, you know, that are beautiful, like essays like Auerbach or something, you know. And I think that, yeah, I mean, in this case, it gives it a certain flow, even though the sentences are fairly simple, although she's also quite abstract. So she'll be or surrealist a little bit or something, right? So an everyday object will be linked to some kind of psychic condition or even cosmic description or something. It's a little bit like astral projection-y or something. It's very.
Could we maybe hear a bit, Jamie?
Yeah, I don't want to read too long, but I could read a little bit. And I also, you know, just have the PDF. All right, so I'll just read a small passage from the beginning of chapter 2. Basically what happens in this book, it's called The Hunger of Women, and it's not, the plot is not so important, but it's about a woman whose husband has died, and she starts to sort of rediscover pleasure through food and cooking, and she opens up her home and starts this restaurant, and she starts having relationships with women, and it's exploring these kind of appetites. So this is the beginning of chapter 2. That night, with the knowledge of food passed down to me by my mother, who, like all women, had spent her life setting the bones of a family at risk of breaking apart at every step because of the bad feelings and resentments between her and my father, while all the time with her rag and duster, she devoted herself to managing the architecture of pain of a house that stood on one of the most beautiful hills in Naples. With that ancient knowledge, I prepared for my restaurant's next opening that night. As I cooked, I recalled the hills above Via Tasso, where we lived when we were little, and I saw the towering and sacred figure of my mother, putting flowers by the photographs of her dead and hanging the laundry out to dry with Assunta. All women, my God, order the bones of creation with you to support buildings, churches, houses, and bridges, and roads, and constellations, and galaxies, and planets, and Milky Ways, and meteorites, and new worlds being formed, where the voice of chaos sings, where the harmony of the celestial spheres coheres. I made a lasagna casserole and 2 big trays of Olivier salad. First, I made the clam sauce for the spaghetti. Then I put a big pot on the stove with tomato sauce, in which I poured some scorpion fish, squids, clams, octopus, codfish, and mullet, and wedge clams, and cockles, and calamari, and shrimp, along with fresh garlic and parsley, to make a thick and succulent fish soup that contains all the ancient flavor of this sea, finite, flayed, furrowed by ships carrying centuries, gold, millennia, wines, spices, oils, handicrafts, freemen, slaves. This sea struck by waves, by lights, which never forgets a vessel, a lighthouse, a house. This sea of buried dead. And back come the millennia and centuries past the buried and reanimated dead, and dark women hunched, shrunken. They weave cloth by the sea. They wait, rip, stitch, add, rip, hook, gather. They give substance to the sea, a sea written, drawn, corporeal. They make it the open, closed body of the age-old sea, barred with columns, with vessels, with lighthouses, sea of war, sea of earth, paper, sea of flesh, sea of flesh, Egyptian, Sicilian, African sea, Italian sea, sea of Spain, France, Greece, Albania, Roman sea, inked, handcrafted, articulated sea, fatigued, never tired of setting forth, Mediterranean.
Wow.
It's very difficult to read.
That was, yeah. That's just.
This is kind of I wanted to include that piece because that piece is kind of a refrain that gets looped in repeatedly throughout the book, and kind of brings together the images, which, right, it's very this bringing in very much an ancient feeling as well. Yeah,
it was incredible. I mean, going in a few paragraphs from the cosmos to the kitchen to the recipe, which then takes you out to the whole of the Mediterranean, and yeah, it's incredible. And I feel so. Thank you very much, Jamie, and for amazing translation. But I feel, Richard, this is perhaps quite Jamie finished there on the word Mediterranean.
Didn't Jamie set me up well?
Well, you know, this wasn't planned, but
didn't Jamie set it up well? So thank you, everybody, for tolerating having me sitting here like a kind of silent ghoul in the background. But Stefan's invited me along because I have taken the plunge in a kind of midlife crisis way, and I am starting a new small independent press. And Stefan has been unbelievably helpful. Stefan and I live quite near each other in the UK, and Stefan has been very, very encouraging. So I've taken the plunge, and there is going to be a new independent press, which is going to be called Foundry Editions. And thank you again, Jamie, for setting it up so perfectly. What I want to concentrate on is literature from the Mediterranean. So very specifically, so my background is Italian, French, and Spanish, and I'm doing it with my cousin who's an Arabist. And sort of together, it sort of made sense that something interesting could come out of it. So as Stefan said, I've come to this very, very sort of halfway through my life, having done lots of other things. And I started at UEA last year doing the MA in literary translation. And it sort of became clear talking to people that actually probably I would be more interested or as interested in becoming a publisher. So there we are, that's it. There's going to be Foundry. Please consider Little Foundry if you make any discoveries, if you have any thoughts, any ideas. It's been absolutely lovely to listen to you and to talk to you. I'm not sure about the boundaries between literary and non-literary. I get kind of, I get a bit jumpy about questions like that. So I'm open to talking about all sorts of things. What we say is that we're about stories from and about the Mediterranean, and, fingers crossed that it'll all be all right.
And Richard, when is it starting? When is
well?
Do you have already some titles?
I have 4. There are 4 books that I am in conversation about. So the plan is, we're starting very small because obviously one has to start very small. And I'm talking about an Italian book, a Spanish book, an Arabic book, and a Cypriot book. Which is really particularly exciting. I'm very thrilled about. And obviously everything's ground to a halt because I'm trying to deal with the Mediterranean in August. So it was all going swimmingly. And then it's like, oh, I'll speak to you on the 4th of September, obviously, which is absolutely fair enough. And so as soon as we can get it going, Georgia, it's a work in progress, but it has gone quicker than I thought, and it's taken on a life of its own. And it's all Stefan Tobler's responsibility for pushing me and encouraging me. But it's very exciting, and hopefully, we get the chance to speak a lot more about things as I have more to say about it. Obviously, I will let everybody know. But
we've shared the website
for letting me make this announcement.
Oh, it's very exciting. It's very exciting.
Are you looking for submissions?
I absolutely will be. I have a sort of Gantt chart, obviously, of things that one needs to do. But yes, I'm really open to talking to people about all sorts of things. I can't promise when anything will happen, but yes, let's talk.
We've shared the website,
and looking forward to hear the new announcements.
Thank you. That's very, very kind of you, everybody. Thank you. So yes, that's why I've been here sitting around, not really saying very much.
No, it's very exciting. Richard's website is in the chat, and from there you can also find his email. So yeah,
absolutely.
It's very exciting, Richard. And your cousin is so you have a background in marketing, and from now on, Foundry is going to be sort of a large part of your life. And is it sort of a similar thing with your cousin? That your cousin is?
Well, my cousin is much older than me. My cousin was a director at. Do you remember a publishing company called Duckworth? They did classics things and like textbooks and then translations of the classics and that sort of thing. So he's terribly eccentric and sort of taught himself Arabic and that kind of thing. And he found out that I was doing the MA at UEA, and he's like, right, we've got to have a publishing company. And you know, I was a bit like, yeah, okay, of course we do. And I sort of went along with it. And then I told Stefan, and Stefan's like, no, you've got to do it. Get on with it.
Oh, no, that's rubbish. Richard knew he was doing it. I didn't.
Anyway.
He was very sure he was doing it. I didn't do a thing.
That's where we are. So hopefully by this time next year, there'll be lots of exciting. Well, hopefully this time in 3 months, there'll be lots of exciting things to tell you all.
Very exciting. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, well, we've been talking for quite a long time. We should probably wrap this up soon, but I don't know if anyone, there's anything else that we should, or anything that people wanted to add before we finish. But,
well, I suppose we should thank you and other stories for interest in Italian literature and for the translations by Brian, Jamie, and all other translators.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, our interest, thanks to Brian and Jamie, really. Yeah. And we've done a few other Italians before. But...
Yeah. I mean, generally, now they are here, but also all the others as well, and the future ones.
Yeah, let's see what happens. We'll be fighting Richard for them now.
Yeah, I can see.
We absolutely, I'm sure we will.
Great stuff. Oh, it's been so lovely to chat to you all, and who knows? Maybe we'll get together to see what's changed in Italian literature and English in a year's time or something.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan.
No.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you very much.
It was lovely. So yeah, happy publication day again, Brian, and
thank you.
Hope to see you all soon. Okay. All right.